Okay,
Right.
Naomi, we're recording, ready to go.
Awesome, thank you. Welcome everybody to LCAP workshop part 2 as an introduction to anything related to LCAP. So today we have our team, Alicia, Brian, and our district fiscal services colleagues, James and Lindsay, who will be joining us for the presentation today. So we'll go ahead and get started, and Brian's going to advance the slides for us. So I just want to recap what we talked about last week. And the next slide, it shows the 4 items that we discussed. So we talked about LCFF, talked about what the 2020 dashboard may or may not have, the LCAP template and instructions, which will continue today, and stakeholder engagement, both the practical aspect as well as what goes into, or what the template looks like for that. And so that you see that through line image there. When we're thinking about the LCAP, these are all the items to consider, and there should be a through line between what you know about your students and their data, any needs that come out of that data analysis, what your stakeholders say about the needs and for actions and services that are based on that data, and then how actions for increased improved services are given some forethought through this analysis and this planning. So as we go through the template and our planning, our development of the LCAP this year, we'll keep that through line in mind. So for today, what we'll look at are the goals and actions section, and in that section it's split up into goals, metrics, and actions. So we'll look at the template and instructions for that today. Lindsay will go over expenditure tables as well as any fiscal considerations, and then we'll jump back into the template or vice versa and go into increased improved services and talk about what that looks like in the template and the requirements. So let's jump into it. First, we're going to get to goals and actions. And first we'll talk about goals. So in your template, that is on page 4 if you wanted to see what that looks like. It's just that top part. The link on the bottom there takes you to the resources. So a digital copy of the template is there, as well as a PDF of the slides if you would like to reference those. So jumping into the goals and actions instructions, excuse me, on page, I believe it's page 4, not page 4, a little further than page 4. On the next slide, Brian, it'll tell them what page to turn to. 12 and 13, I was far away from page 4. So on pages 12 and 13 of your template are the instructions for the goals and actions. So what we're doing right now is just looking at the all of 12 and up to 3/4 of the way down 13. So I'll give you a moment to read it. If you have a handy dandy pen or a marker and want to annotate as you read, there are some annotation marks there for you suggested to help you with your close reading. So I'll pause and give you some time to read. Okay, let's come back together. Hopefully you had a chance to read most of that section or review it again if you've already looked at it. Did anyone have anything that stood out to them that they'd like to share about the goals and action section? Okay, you'll notice that just like all the other areas of the instructions, it starts, there's a purpose and then requirements and instructions that follow that. And so on the next slide, I'd like to share the opportunity for prioritization. In previous LCAPs, this wasn't distinctly called out, but in this LCAP, districts have an opportunity to do so. You don't have to label it your goal as a priority goal, but on page 12, it does talk about well-developed goals and how they clearly communicate to stakeholders exactly what the LEA wants to accomplish. And so on the next slide also, that prioritization continues in terms of explanation with the purpose of it. And so really it's to just to express to stakeholders why you chose this goal and what that what opportunity that is for you to highlight any performance by a particular student group or data or any actions that align to it that will follow subsequently. So that's on page 13. When we get to the next slide, again, it's just a reminder of the through line that I talked about earlier. So when we get to goals and developing them, you will have already known your students, their data, and are discussing this with your stakeholders to determine these goals. So let's look at the types of goals. In this template, there are 3 types of goals. On page 13, it talks about those. So there's the focus goal, the broad goal, and the maintenance goal. So the definitions are there. Those are lifted directly from the instructions on what each is. You can see that we'll go through what each of those goals are in the subsequent slides. So the focus goal, you can see in bold on the next slide. It's almost like a SMART goal. Well, it is like a SMART goal. It's specific, measurable, time bound, and it is around data. So it's a data intensive approach to writing a goal. I'll show you some examples a little later. We continue to talk about focus goals on the next slide. When we talk about the data that it's based on, it can be based on dashboard data or other locally collected data that you have, as we know that dashboard is not the only source of data when determining goals for students. And then of course, any consultation with stakeholders on the data for the goal is important to take into account. Let's talk about a broad goal next. And in a broad goal, this is what generally most goals have been thus far in LCAP. So it's a goal that is just broad and gives a general idea of where the actions and services around which will determine outcomes for kids. So a broad goal could be around instruction or academics. Another broad goal could be around professional development or community involvement. And another broad goal that I've seen people have is around basic needs. And so it can be different, and a lot of different actions can align to it, as well as metrics under that broad goal. The next slide also talks about a broad goal, but it's an explanation of why the LEA would choose this goal. So basically it's when you explain it, because in the template for each goal you choose, whether it's a focus goal, broad goal, or a maintenance goal, there is an explanation of why the LEA is focusing on this goal that is part of the template. Let's look at examples of both a focus and a broad goal. So on the left, you can see a focus goal. We've got District XYZ, increasing attendance rate for particular student groups, your students with disabilities, homeless and foster youth, and socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So that is very data focused. You've got your percentage and how much they want to increase to by a certain time. In a broad goal, so the broad goal is around mastery of grade level content to meet UC or CSU requirements. So you can see that that is more academically based, and so the kinds of metrics that will go around that will align to demonstration of mastery of content. And in the focus goal, the metrics will be very specific to attendance, and particularly for these student groups. I think I have another example there. And the next one, we've got, for the focus goal, we've got referral rates for African American students, very, very specific to one student group with the particular aim that they want by 50% by 2023. And then the broad goal is the involvement and engagement of parents, students, and community for student success. Hopefully you can see the distinction there. I believe we have, on the next slide, we're going to now talk about maintenance of progress goals. So this goal added was a little confusing because people might say, well, what's a maintenance of progress goal? Basically, it's how you intend to maintain progress in any of the state priorities that are not addressed. So if you have a very specific focus goal, then some of the things that you continue to do, you would still want to capture in your LCAP. And so this is kind of where you take any goals that aren't particularly related to a particular focus goal or even a broad goal, and you can call those maintenance progress goals, because there's actions and services you're continuing to provide for students, but may not necessarily fit under a particular category. And here is what the maintenance, how, when you're using this type of goals to, you are determining that as I mentioned before, it's you're just talking about any actions that you want to maintain and progress you want to monitor regarding outcomes for students as related to those specific actions and services. And that's on page 14. I think all of them are described on page 14. When we go to the next slide, it talks about the explanation of why you would use the goal. And again, it's just to explain how actions will sustain your success or the student's success related to the metrics for that goal. And so those are the three goals. I'll give you a few minutes to process that. So what is your understanding of the different goal types? What might be a benefit of writing a focus goal or a broad goal or a maintenance goal? And how might you engage stakeholders in determining which type of goals are most appropriate to address student needs? I'll go ahead and take questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves. Can you provide an example of maintenance of progress goals?
Naomi, you mind if I take a stab at that question?
Yes, please do.
So in the chat, there's a question. Can you provide an example of a maintenance of progress goal? So one that comes to mind in my previous district, I know we had as one of our metrics, and it's one of the state priorities, was teachers, fully credentialed teachers and all EL certification. Well, our district was fortunate enough to have 100% of our teachers have EL compliance, EL certification, and fully credentialed. So I would put that in the maintenance of progress category. So we've already met the standard of 100%. So we still probably need to do some things around that to make sure we were continue to be 100%. But it's not something that's going to be a high priority focus for our district because we already met that standard, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Brian. That is a good example. Does anybody else have a different one they might want to share? And as we get into LCAP development during the workshops too, we'll be going into the writing of goals. So there will be a lot of sharing of that too, but great question, Alejandro. All right, so I guess we'll go on then. And actually, I'm going to pass the baton to Brian. He's going to talk to you about metrics part of action, goals and actions.
Yes, I get to talk about the fun thing around metrics. And let's just say right off at the start, this is going to be a challenging year for metrics just because we don't have a lot of our data sources that we ordinarily will have. We know that we will not have a dashboard here in 2020. But as we go through this information today, there is quite a bit of information you do have access to just within your student information system or through CalPads. So we'll kind of talk about some of that. So again, we're going to start off with what we've done with every other section. I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes and read the instructions. It starts on the bottom of page 14, goes through page 15 and the top of page 16. So I'm going to pause for a minute, ask you to refer to your instructions and give you a moment to read those. Okay, if you would kind of wrap up your reading, and again, we're gonna, in addition to today, we'll be diving into this in our regular LCAP workshops throughout the year. Before I move on, is there anyone that has, a burning question that arises, something that you feel like you need clarification on at this point? Anything I can address?
Brian, this is Camille over at TIA. Could you talk a little bit about how your metrics need to relate to the state priorities?
Camille, I actually have a couple of slides that directly address that here in a few minutes. So if you don't mind, I might defer the answer. And then at the end, if you don't feel like I answered it quite completely, feel free to ask again, if that's all right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, well, let's move on. And as I said at the end of my section, again, we'll have another reflection slide. So if something percolates up that you would like us to try and get an answer for, be happy to do that. So, as Camille just asked about, one thing that is required is you are required to have metrics related to each of the 8 state priorities. For those of you that had familiarity with the old template, the previous LCAP template, you actually specified which state priority or priorities that a particular goal was aligned to. In the new template, those boxes don't exist. So the only way that to be sure that you've addressed all of the 8 state priorities is to make sure you have at least one metric for each of the 8 state priorities. So this chart gives kind of the basic minimums of what's aligned to the 8 state priorities. Certainly, you can have additional metrics beyond these. The other challenge we know that right now in that first column, the state indicators that would ordinarily be on the dashboard, as I said, those are not going to be published this year in the dashboard. However, we'll talk about how you might get some of that data regardless. Notice we do have the local indicators highlighted there. And let me take a moment and just revisit that. We talked about a little bit last week. So as you know, with no dashboard this year, you are not reporting your local indicators to the state. So ordinarily that deadline would be now. They would have been asking for that by like the end of October. And that would be, you would be reporting your results from your 1920 process. You would be reporting those results for the 2020 dashboard. So that's not occurring. But what does need to happen is you do need to follow through the self-reflection activities for the 2021 school year. So they've not made any changes to those rubrics. So you can go onto the CDE webpage. I did place a copy of that self-reflection tool. It's in the shared folder. I dropped it in there this morning, so you had easy access to it. So you can follow those self-reflection activities, work with your stakeholder teams. Thank you, Melissa. I think she just posted the webpage in as well in the chat. So you need to be completing that process in the course of this school year. So it's not a one-time thing you do in the fall to report on the dashboard. It really should be an ongoing process. You're engaging your stakeholders. Some of those self-reflection tools to do well requires you to reach out to stakeholders and complete that process. You need to then share that information with your stakeholders and with your board as you develop this LCAP. And you need to present the information to your board as you normally would in any other year. You're going to do that this coming spring as part of your LCAP process. Then a year from now, presumably next October-ish, you will then post these results in the dashboard reporting tool to appear on the 2021 dashboard. So you do need to do local indicators this year as part of your process. You're just not reporting anything from last year on this year's dashboard. So I hope that kind of made sense. But again, if I need to clarify more, I'd be happy to. So a reminder that the dashboard indicators are not your only source of data. So while you might be minimally compliant if you only included dashboard indicators, they probably don't tell the whole story for your LEA. And so you're going to identify what your baseline data is, and we'll kind of step through that here in a moment. So these instructions at this point haven't been changed. It says LEAs may use data as reported on the 2019 dashboard for the baseline of a metric, only if that data represents the most recent available. So in some cases, that will be the most recent available, but in others it may not. And we'll kind of go through some examples. So they do want you, however, to report data consistent with how it's on the dashboard as best you can. And that's for ease of use with your stakeholders and to make sure that all the data you're presenting is, it makes sense to whoever's looking at that data. So Camille, here's your answer, the next couple of slides. So the next, I think there's 3 slides here in a row. These slides indicate what's in statute as required indicators. And there's a little key at the top of this page where you ordinarily would get this data from. So, so on this page for priorities 1, 2, and 7, all of those required metrics could be found in your dashboard local indicator rubrics. So all of these should be accessible to you this year because, as I just stated a few slides ago, you're going to go through this process this school year. So you're not reporting last year's data, you're reporting current year data as you're developing your LCAP. Hopefully that makes sense. this is where you're going to have to do some thinking through these things. So under priority for pupil achievement, you will see ordinarily 4 of those you would get from your dashboard data. So the first one being state CAS assessments. So you will have to use your 2019 dashboard for that data, because that is the most recent that you have there. It's not published in 2020. You might start thinking through now, what other metrics might you want to use alongside the required state CAS assessments? For example, if your district is doing some other district benchmarking, if you're using some other assessment programs like NEA or iReady or something like that, you may want to report those as metrics as well. But you do have to report state CAS data, and you're going to have to use 2019 dashboard. Now, some of these, like the next one for completed A through G, you would ordinarily get that from additional reports on the dashboard. They may publish some of that data either there or on DataQuest. However, you can get that from your local internal data from your CalPADS reporting. So you can get 2020 results for this if you use your CalPADS data. Percent of ELs who make progress on proficiency using the LPAC. Again, I think that one you're going to have to go back to 2019 because 2020 was suspended and then has been optional. EL reclassification rate, that will be published. Percent of students who pass AP exam, again, may or may not be on the dashboard additional reports this year, but you have access to that data in your CalPAD. You don't have that in CalPADS, but you can get those reports from the College Board. They share that with you back. Students prepared by the EAP, you will only be able to go back to 2019 on that because you won't have 2020 data. Other pupil outcomes are things that you can already use your local data for, like through your student information system, so that hasn't changed. Last one of these slides, the parent involvement can be assessed through your local indicators or other local measures that you have. Pupil engagement, this is something and school climate. So notice on some of these you would ordinarily get from your dashboard. Some of these you can get from DataQuest. So everything that's on this page, even though it's not published on the dashboard, you have locally for 2020. For example, attendance rates. You've always had to do locally. Chronic absenteeism. The state's not going to publish a number, but you do have your district data. But you might want to think about what's best for your LEA. So the example I'll use is suspension rates. So you certainly can go back and report your suspension rates for the 1920 school year and use that as your baseline. However, think through doing that. I just know from being a middle school principal, if I got to cut off my suspensions every year in mid-March, I would have had the best suspension rate ever for a middle school in California, because my memory is it seemed like 80% of any issues we had in discipline all occurred in April and May. So, so the data that you get, although you have the data for 1920 school year, it may not be the best comparable data. So maybe you report both, but you know, you need to kind of think through what's best in your situation. So, so again, you have everything on here, even though it's not reported on the dashboard. You may have to pull it from your SIS or from your CalPADS reports. Some of it will be still reported on DataQuest. For example, they're still going to report suspension and expulsion data on DataQuest. But again, is it really a valid comparison? I think you want to think through that. Okay, so those are the required metrics, but you can certainly have more, and you probably do want to have more. One thing that's not really on here and you may want to include, I know most districts now are doing some kind of social emotional assessment. The one is very common, like from Panorama Education. So you might want to include that maybe in pupil engagement or school climate would be the best place for that. And that may be a very important measure. As we know, COVID has affected kids significantly in their social emotional well-being. So that might be a very good measure to include and then be able to show progress over time, how that's including. So just my little recommendation there on that one. So how is this going to actually look on the template? So here's what this kind of looks like. However, I'm going to caution right at the beginning. What you see on here is from the most recent adopted template. If you look at the lines along the top, those dates may need to change because right now the template, you would be reporting this year what you had in the 1920, 2021 year. So the years might change, just be aware of that. We'll kind of work through this. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to put your metric in and kind of a best practice, note the origin and year of the data so it's real clear. Don't just say our suspension rate, be real specific. Say our 18-19 suspension rate for all students was, for English learners was, for students with disabilities was, you know, specify it out. And then you're going to be completing the desired outcome. What's your target? Where do you want to be in 3 years? Those middle columns you're going to leave blank right now. And I'm going to show you an example here in a moment. So for this LCAP cycle, you need to identify your baseline and you need to identify a target where you want to be in 3 years. When we get into the actual LCAP workshops coming up, our colleague Steve Aon has created a really cool tool in oh my gosh, the name of it just went right out of my mind.
Tableau.
Tableau, thank you.
Tableau.
Oh my gosh, brain freeze. So in Tableau, he has created, you can pull up your district, your school, and put in it'll pull up where you're at, and it'll help you set those targets and kind of where to do. So you're going to see a demo of that. You'll be able to play around with that. It is live in Tableau now, but just kind of put a little tease out there. So what does this look like in practice? So here's an example, and this is an example using smarter balance data, but it certainly can be any piece of data. So again, identify your baseline. So this example says our baseline for 18-19 SBAC, all students were 40 points above standard. EL students were here, low income, so on and so forth. And then even listing the data source. So that helps, that's maybe helps the reader, but who it really helps is you writing it or whoever's writing it the next year. Because I will tell you, I've had the experience of writing LCAPs where the next year you go to report your outcomes and it takes you half a day to remember, how did I get last year's number? So the more you can be specific and detailed, the better. And then again, you're going to leave blank the actual outcomes because we don't have actual outcome data. And then you're going to set a desired outcome. Where do you want to be out in the ending year? And so, so these points are set. So how do you develop these targets? Part of that is your stakeholder input. Your stakeholders can tell you where you think they want to be. You can also use those other tools, like I mentioned, the Tableau tool. The other thing I will note here, if you kind of take a look at the outcomes here, there's different outcomes listed for different student groups. And part of that is to think about how you're closing achievement gaps. So if a student group is a little farther behind, you might want to set a more aggressive target for that group. So, so that's kind of a picture of how that might look. As I said, we'll dive more deeper into this and do examples, and the idea will give you time to really dig into your specific data during the LCAP workshops, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a preview. The last thing I'll kind of finish with is, again, there's that through line down at the bottom. So throughout your document, we should see an alignment. So you've identified your greatest needs and your successes in the opening section of the LCAP. Well, if something's a greatest need, then we should see metrics around that need, and we should see goals and actions around that need, right? And so, you know, throughout the document, we're going to keep revisiting this idea of having this alignment across the document. So that's the metrics section, brief overview. And so again, now's our time to pause and just, you know, a couple of questions here we can, to prompt the conversation, but if there's other questions, certainly feel free to ask. But how are you determining metrics in your LCAP? Have you thought about that at this point? How do you ensure stakeholders understand the metrics? I think that's a big thing. Are they aligning to goals and actions? And most importantly, is it going to be able to support effectiveness down the road? So a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, are you going to be able to is it going to really show that you're being successful? So I will pause talking. I'll start the timer. Give you a little think time, but again, if you've got questions or anything, feel free to unmute.
There is a question in the chat, Brian. I'm not sure if you want to look at that.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the CAS metrics and developing annual progresses for using 2019 results. Suggestions? Yeah, so here's going to be the trick. You're going to have to report your 2019 CAS results because that's in statute. But you probably also want to report additional metrics that are kind of aligned. So as I mentioned, you know, if you've got other assessment systems that you're using, like the ones I know that are very common is like using iRating, for example, or the NWEA assessments. That's giving you some other kind of data that can help you track your students' progress over time. That may be useful also. Hope that kind of helps. And I agree. Someone put in the chat privately to me, the suspension rate will be awesome in 1920 and 2021. We got to take the wins when we can. Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping your 2021 suspension rate is like 0 right now. But you also don't want to take the jump in 21, 22 when your change is about infinity. Naomi, I think we're a little ahead of time, so maybe we can have a discussion around this. Are you anticipating that a lot of LEAs will use their baseline as their desired outcome, considering the learning loss that has occurred last year and this year? So if I'm interpreting the question, let me go back. I think what you're saying is almost make your desired outcome basically the same as your baseline, because you're assuming that there's a large learning loss this year and maybe last year and this year.
Or even just the actual outcome for 2021, not maybe the 22, 23. I'm hoping we can make progress, but.
You know, that's a tricky question. I'll give you my sense of it, and then I'm sure others might want to chime in. Certainly that's going to need to be a good discussion with your stakeholders. And the more you can share with them your current data, I think help drives that discussion. So if you have better current data that is showing that learning loss, so like I said, for example, the one I'll go back to is iReady because I'm familiar with that product. So if you're using that in your district and that's showing a pretty significant learning loss, and you can share that data with your stakeholders and articulate, even though this is where SBAC was, a year ago now, we think we're really kind of here now. We're lower than where we were because of the learning loss that's occurred. So we want to set a target, to kind of get whole again before we move forward. I think as long as you can articulate that with your stakeholders and they buy into that, then there's nothing wrong with that.
And Brian, can I add to that?
Yeah.
This is Melissa. So if you're considering, like, as we know, we don't have our CASP results from 2019. So if we wanted to still use the dashboard data and put our metric as Smarter Balanced Assessment from the dashboard as our baseline, we actually wouldn't be filling in the actual outcomes. We would only be filling out that 3-year outcome. So we actually are going to have a gap of time there. So we want to think forward. What will we expect of our students 3 years from now, not just within 1 year? So we don't have the interim metrics like we had in the prior template. So again, we could use the 19 dashboard as our baseline. But if we want to, as Brian was describing, talk about a more frequent measure that is something that is still comparable over time, and our district has adopted some type of a diagnostic or some type of an assessment that is consistent over time, then that can be an additional metric. So we might have one for the Smarter Balanced ELA, but we might have a second metric that would be that local assessment, the iReady, the NWEA map, the whatever assessment where the a Smarter Balanced interim, comprehensive, whatever the case may be. So then we have not only our baseline data, our statewide data from the dashboard that will reflect upon over time, we'll have that local data that can then support any identification of learning loss and then how progress is made over time.
And let me just wrap up by saying, I do believe, again, as Melissa said, it's a 3-year goal, unlike the last template where you were setting those targets year by year. So I do believe it's also important to set realistic but aspirational targets. So give yourself something to stretch for. Make it realistic within the realm of possibility. But the hope would be 3 years from now, we've mitigated most, if not all, of the learning loss that's occurred. That would be my goal. Okay, I think we're ready to move on. And I think it's going back to Naomi.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. Great discussion on metrics. And again, we will be diving into those during our LCAP workshops, as Brian alluded. All right, so now let's look at the last part of goals and actions, which is your actions table. So on page 4 of your template, you can see at the very bottom, there is an action table there. And know that that table is not limited to just those boxes. You can add rows and columns as necessary when you add actions. So we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. On the next slide, I wanted to talk about the narrowing focus on actions and how we get from actions for everybody to contributing actions. So Brian, if you click that first click, we start at the base with forethought. And when we're looking at forethought, as we look at our through line, we talk about the needs of our students, what our data tells us, and our discussion with our stakeholders. And so we keep going up to the next layer of the pyramid, and we get to our through line where we keep that forethought as our guiding principle for LCAP development. So what do we know, and how are we infusing those ideas and desires based on what we know our kids need, and putting those into our actions and services based on our data and what our stakeholders say. And then finally, for contributing at the very top layer, we narrow the focus to identify actions that we want to consider as meeting the increased improved services requirement. And so what are those actions that might be provided on a wide basis, a school-wide or district-wide basis, but that are particularly directed to our unduplicated student groups, our English learners, our foster youth, and our limited income students. And so that is just a conceptual idea of developing our actions and narrowing the focus. And the next slide just underscores again the idea of the through line. So when we think of our actions and services, do we know what outcomes we expect to get? And do our actions align to those outcomes? Now let's dive into the template a little bit. So you saw that on page 4. And so on the next slide, I lifted some language from the instructions to highlight. And so if we go to the next slide, Brian, thank you. So these are 2 excerpts from the instructions that reference development of the actions in a well-developed LCAP. So we want alignment between all sections of the plan so that, in other words, a through line. So it'll be evident to readers and it supports the plan's cohesion and coherence. And so a best practice might be to assess the performance of all students and student groups in order to identify the needs and the basis for any actions that are put into the plan. So you'll get to read that in a little bit, but the next slide, I actually lifted again the instructions and then just highlighted the different sections that align to the action table in the template. So if you go to the next slide, Brian, I think you just have to click in all of the, oh, there it goes. So there's each section in the instructions that aligns to the actual template. And so you'll see there's a little message box there that says, if you're using the e-template, it will have functionality to populate between the goals and actions in the data entry tables, which we'll talk about later on. So these amounts will be in the contributing to column, whether it's a yes or no, will be populated based on what is entered in the data entry tables, which are the Excel sheets that I shared as an attachment, and we'll talk about those later.
Naomi, can I just add to that, on the back of the previous slide, the short title is important because that's what carries forward to the expenditure tables. So if a stakeholder is just interested in how you're spending your money, they might not look through all of these descriptions. They might look at the short title and they might look at the expenditure tables as a way to see these are all the shortened version of what the action is plus how much money is being expended. So, or planned to be expended. So again, keep in mind that the title not only is evident here, it's then going to carry forward into the expenditure tables.
Thank you, Melissa, for pointing that out. Okay, so let's dive into just a few kinds of actions that are going to be required in this plan. So actions for English learners, this is Ed Code 52064. This is a stipulation to include actions related to language acquisition programs for EL students, as well as professional development activities you have for staff that supports learning for English learners. And so, so remember to have those kinds of actions in your plan. And then when we get to the next slide, you also have to, it's a requirement to have actions for English learners. And then, oh, sorry, you were going to say something, Brian?
I was just going to remind it, because it says numerically significant, that's going to be 30 students. That's the number you need to have a color on the dashboard. So, so if you have 30 students in your 30 English learners in your LEA, or if you're a charter school, you have at least 30. You do need to include, meet this requirement. I mean, you certainly can if you have less anyways, but you must if you have at least 30.
And again, when we get to LCAP workshops and go into the writing of actions, we'll be providing some examples and having discussion about these actions for English learners. And then the next slide, the ed code, the same ed code says that districts are encouraged to include specific actions in the LCAP for foster youth students. And so the previous slide I said must include, and this one says encouraged to include. So those are part of the same ed code, and you have the option to include actions specific to foster youth. And again, we'll talk about examples when we get into writing actions. So I want to go to the next slide and just give you some points on action descriptions. So on the left-hand column, when we're planning for our actions, and you guys are familiar with this if you were the author or helped support the writing of the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan. This is actually new to the LCAP template in terms of having to describe the needs, conditions, and circumstances of low-income ELs and foster youth. And so when designing actions and services, and again, here's where the forethought comes in, what are those needs, conditions of your unduplicated student groups that, that would have stakeholders say, well, our data says this, and so we'd really like for this action to be principally directed and marked as contributing to meeting the increased improved services requirement. And when you describe that, you have to describe those needs. And then when we look at the second bullet, we think as part of the planning, are the descriptions for identified student groups developed after the fact or not clearly articulated? And so we think if we're doing forethought, we're thinking ahead to our student group's needs and what our actions might say in the description, as opposed to, oh, we have this, so oh yeah, let's make sure that we say that it's for our unduplicated students. And so we want to try to have forethought as opposed to afterthought when we're planning our actions. And then when it comes to writing the actions, and we'll get into this again when we're in our LCAP workshops, those 3 bullets are checkpoints just to reflect on the description. Do actions describe who's doing what for whom? Do the actions address underlying causes that impact low performance of identified student groups? And are actions tied to specific outcomes or intended student groups? And so again, we'll delve into this as we go into writing the LCAP later on. The next slide talks about the annual update. And so in the template, there is this section called goal analysis. For this year, as you can see on the slide, the annual update will be developed by CDE by January 31st. And it's required that actions and expenditures from the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan are part of that annual update, as well as those that will be from the 2019-20 LCAP. And so that template actually is being developed, and I have a reminder at the end, but I'll tell you now that CDE is hosting a Tuesday at 2 on the annual update template and would like to gather stakeholder input. So that's next Tuesday, October 27th at 2 p.m. So I'll send a reminder about that. But for now, for our purposes here, this template won't be used. The annual update will be a standalone template, and we will delve into that when we get into our LCAP workshops. And of course, we have to wait until the template is developed. I think we're at the end of the action section. So I have a few questions. And like Brian said earlier, we can respond to these, or if you think of something, please call it out or put it in the chat. So related to actions, how might you identify student needs and the basis for actions in your LCAP? Do metrics support your ability to demonstrate effectiveness of actions? And how might you engage stakeholders in determining actions to include in your LCAP? Thank you, Melissa, for posting that link to CDE site.
So Naomi, let me, there's a question that was sent to me directly in the chat, and I just want to answer for the whole group. So the question was related to, because we stated that you need to address all 8 state priorities. And so the question that came to me is, does that mean I need to have a goal for each priority? And the answer is no. Remember, a goal can address more than one state priority at a time. You know, it's pretty typical in LCAPs. We see maybe 3, 4, or 5 goals. So obviously those goals are covering, you know, several priorities at once. You certainly can have more goals than that, but that's not a requirement. You know, hopefully that clears that up.
Thank you, Brian. And I see that you've responded to some things in the chat, so thank you for that. All right, as you think about it, so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take our break and take a little stretch break, do what you need to do, and we can come back in 5 minutes. So if you would please come back at 2:03, we'll see you then, and we'll get started on the next section.
I'll be right back.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to go over to Alicia now, who will talk about increased or improved services. Take it on, Alicia.
All right, you guys. So increased and improved services. So those of you who went through the learning continuity attendance plan with us understand that this is probably one of the hardest sections to get through and to get like approval on the first time, because it's a lot of writing. It's deceptive, right? It's one little page, you think, when you look at it. Not so. It's a little bit more than that. And it's a lot of writing and a lot of explaining. So we're going to go through it. Today is just an overview, but you know, if you guys have any questions on it, and this is another language, right? For those of you who are brand new, we're saying words that you're like, what does that even mean? Please don't be afraid to ask. You know, at any point, if you're like, what is, you know, any of these words mean, please just pop in and ask. That's why we're here. So go ahead and look at pages 16 through 19. Just glance at them really quick. I'll give you guys like just a minute or so to look through there. And then we'll start talking about increase and improved services. All right, I'm not going to take too much longer. Looks like, well, I think we're ready. So I'm just going to move on. All right. So the thing that sticks out to me on this page is the purpose of this section. And the purpose of this section is for an LEA to explain how it plans to increase and improve services for its unduplicated pupils compared to all students. So that's what you're doing in this section. And that's going to take more than just one sentence. It's not easy to do. Go ahead, Brian, go to the next slide. So it's made up of these 4 little boxes. The first one is the proportionality percentage, and that's the percentage by which you need to increase or improve those services. That's the percentage you need to show. The box right next to that is the funding amount that you're going to get to do that. And then fiscal, if I'm wrong on anything, jump in. The box underneath that is an explanation for your LEA-wide or school-wide actions that you put in your plan and you mark as contributing to. So Naomi showed you, I think it's slide 36, the box that you put the action, you put the title, you went through, and then the last box, you're gonna put either a Y or an N. And if you put a Y in there and it's a school-wide action, you're gonna have to explain it in this section, in that first prompt. And then the second prompt there is a description of how services are increased or improved overall for your kiddos. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. Go ahead there. All right. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I get it all, because this is a big part. So minimum proportionality percentage. So an LEA shall provide, and it says shall provide evidence in its LCAP to demonstrate how funding that you're given based on the number of and concentration of your unduplicated pupils is used to support those pupils. And that's what you have to explain in this section. The funding shall be used to increase or improve services for these unduplicated pupils as compared to services provided. So that's what, if you guys hear the phrase minimum proportionality percentage, that's what we're talking about. You have to say what is being increased or improved and for who. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Can I just jump in real quick? I think a
Please,
common
absolutely.
question here is like, okay, so where do I get that right number from? And I guess James could correct me, but usually we ask people to go to the FICMAT calculator.
It's on the next slide.
Is it on the next slide? I apologize. Okay.
That's okay. I was going to mention it here, but you're absolutely right. So it's FICMAT, or what I was also going to suggest. Oh, look, James gave us a thumbs up. What I used to do is just go to my fiscal and say, hey guys, what's the number? And if they didn't know, they could call RCOE, or, you know,
And the number will change about 5 or 6 times as they're developing the budget, but that's just another.
That's James' fault.
It's technically the LCFF calculator that they're using. It's just developed by FICMAT to do it. So if you say the LCFF calculator or the FICMAT LCFF calculators, they'll know what you're talking about. Like, just go to your fiscal folks. This is something they work with all through the budget process.
Is there any questions on that, you guys?
I'm just gonna say that the best way to get that number is calling RCOE. That's all.
Just call James. He's bored.
Oh, just call Lindsay.
Oh, okay. All right. So, like I explained before, that proportionality percentage is the percentage by which services for unduplicated pupils must be increased or improved compared to the services for all students. Your increased apportionment is based on the enrollment of your foster youth, your English learners, and your low-income students. And you know, now you know how to get those numbers. So,
And my last little point there, Alicia, and you can ask me later how I know it. Just for the newbies, if the number isn't right, it's going to get kicked back to you. So don't guess on the number. Don't say, I think it's about this. Don't round it. So whatever the number is, put in the actual number, because your fiscal folks will be submitting the budget alongside the LCAP, and they're going to compare and make sure the numbers match. And if they don't match, it's going to be kicked back to the district or LEA to correct.
And we work closely with fiscal as well. I mean, that's why they're on this call, right? This is a whole team effort when we're reviewing these as well, to go over and, you know, does this number match? Is this what it's supposed to be? And if not, why? You know, we have those conversations as well. So if you have any issues or questions, let us know. All right, next slide. Okay, so the first prompt there, it's one sentence, but it's loaded with a lot of things that you have to do in there. So it says, for each action being provided to an entire school or across an entire district. So that's one part of it. So it's an action that's for an entire school or an entire district that is in your plan that you have marked as contributing to. So an action in your plan you've marked as yes, that is school-wide or district-wide or LEA-wide, whatever you want to call it. You have to have an explanation of how the needs of foster youth, English learners, and low-income students was considered first, and how that action is going to be effective in meeting the goals for those students. Does that sound familiar for some of you that wrote an LCP? That some of you that wrote that learning continuity plan? Yeah, we had those conversations, right? Because and this is new to the LCAP, but they thought, hey, let's practice on the learning continuity plan, right? And threw it in for you guys. So there's a lot in that that piece there. I think somebody asked, I was kind of, can you get some, there actually is a sample of this. Was it this one? On the top of page 18, they have a sample of this. So from the CDE in their very own template, and it's an attendance example. And they talk about they've assessed their needs and conditions of low income, and they see that attendance rates are worse for their low income EL students. But they realize that attendance is going to be useful for all of their kids if they focus on attendance. So they're going to do a school-wide or a district-wide attendance incentive. And then the way it's gonna help everybody, but it's really gonna help their low income or foster youth or English learners because they have such low attendance rates. So if you look at that, it's at the top of page 18 and it's there for you. You guys have this out when you're writing your plan next to you. It's a great resource to use as an example. So I hope, did that answer your question there? I don't know who answered that, ASLA. And we will go over in our other LCAP workshops ways to write this. We're going to do a lot of practice with this section over the next few workshops, probably in each one. So, all right. Next slide. So describing an action is principally directed and effective. So you need to think about, and like we just talked about, the needs, conditions, and circumstances, how you considered those, and then is it effective? What are you gonna do to go ahead, Brian, click one more time. So what specifically are we trying to accomplish? What change, the action are we going to do and why? And then how is that change gonna improve? That's our improvement cycle, right? That we're thinking about our improvement, just like we always do, right? With our kiddos, we're always trying to continuously improve our practice. All right. Again, this is the same thing over again. I'm not gonna beat a dead horse, but these are the things that you really have to demonstrate in that prompt. All right, go ahead. Here's another example. I'll give you guys a second to read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Give me a thumbs up when you're done. Tim's doing a head nod. I think that's the same. Oh, Lorelai, thank you. All right, I think we're good. So you can see in here that they indicated a performance gap in reading comprehension, and they realized they don't have access to reading materials. So they implemented a school-wide action of these book in a bag programs for everybody, realizing that it's going to affect their English learners more. Oh, that's just how you read, Tim? You bob your head? That's great. Hey, it works. Get you through. So they realize that it's going to improve they're going to try and implement it to improve the results by the end of the year summative reading and increase their CAS ELA scores, specifically for their English learners. All right, go ahead. In the next slide, Brian, we've broken it down. The needs, conditions, and circumstances, actions, and expected outcomes. You can see it's all broken down right there. Performance gaps, no access to reading materials, the actions after school reading club, and they want a 3.5% increase in performance by the end of the year and an improvement in CAS scores. So any questions on that, what that should look like? It's a lot, and we know it's a lot. And every single action does not have to look like that. So don't feel like every single action I write is going to look like that. Don't stress about that. And we'll talk about that at another workshop, but I don't want you to go into your weekend crying. Okay, you're going to be okay. We're here for you. There's going to be a way to get through it. All right. So
Alicia, can I interject there? Sorry.
Yes, please.
Just to kind of bring it back to kind of the overarching reason why it's so particular for this section. Under LCFF, we know that districts are receiving additional funds to provide the increased and improved services for unduplicated pupils. And so this tends to be the section of the plan that's most highly scrutinized, simply for the fact that with those additional funds comes the responsibility and obligation to provide increased and improved services. So whenever we hear anything at the state level about districts being reviewed or LCAPs being reviewed or our statewide audit, it tends to focus on this section simply because there is a desire from the public to be sure that those funds are truly addressing the student groups that have demonstrated the greatest need. So again, this isn't an RCOE thing, and we don't intend to be sticklers about it, but following the guidance from the template and the instructions from the template, we do want to support you in how we can craft those statements so it communicates to your stakeholders, this is how we intend to increase and improve services. As stewards of public funds, we want to demonstrate that to you as our community. And so this is the section where it enables you to communicate that to your community.
Thank you, Melissa. And like Melissa said, our goal is to support you. So we're here to help for whatever you need. So, Another thing, and we do see this quite often, is those conclusory statements. It's just, if you have an action and you just say this action is principally directed toward and effective in meeting the needs of unduplicated pupils or students, that's not going to be acceptable. And it even says that in the instructions this year. So just making that statement is not going to be enough to say, oh, it's principally directed. Like Melissa said, they want to see the explanation. The stakeholders deserve an explanation for how these funds are being spent. Go ahead to the next slide. Also, enrollment is not a justification. And I know this is a hard one, having come from a low income district, but because you have you can't just say because we have a high enrollment of unduplicated students, the actions will invariably improve outcomes for our unduplicated students. You have to be specific when you're talking about your how you considered the needs and how these actions are going to have effective outcomes for these students. Okay, next slide. They're not acceptable because they don't provide a through line between the need and the action. There's no clear connection between the action and the intended outcome, and they don't reflect that forethought. So remember, throughout this whole plan, we want to see that what you said is a need up at the very top of the plan, and the metrics that you put in and the goals and the actions that you put in are going to be spoken about at the bottom of the plan in this increase improve section. And that whole thing is going to fit together and look for that through line. So we want to see it. So make sure that's all there. Make sure your stakeholders can see it as well. All right. And then the last one there is a description of how services provided for unduplicated pupils are increased or improved by at least the percentage calculated. So that percentage that you put in compared to all services for all students. So this one's kind of tricky because so to improve services means that you can grow services in quality, right? Increase means you can grow them in quantity. Services are increased or improved by the actions in the LCAP. So you mark them as contributing. I'm trying to see if I don't want to read the last bullet. Okay, so just because a service is increased or improved does not necessarily mean that it always has money attached to it. So that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So you have to start thinking about how you can show that you've improved services, even though you might not have spent more money. So one of the things that I like to talk about is you might improve services for your English learners by improving the quality of your interactions with aides, right? So if you have aides that are working with your English learner students and they're, you've found a program maybe that they're using, or they were making copies last year and now they're actually working with students one-on-one in small groups, you've definitely improved the quality. So instead of saying we've spent this much money, because you haven't spent more money, it's the same amount of money because you're still paying the aides the same amount of money. How can you show that you've increased that service or improved that service? You could probably show data, right? You can say that we've improved it by this much percent because the kids are doing this much better. So start thinking of ways that you can show that you not only increase services, but improve services as well by that percentage. Go ahead to the next slide. I think that's my last one. So when you, this is part of the, and Lindsay's going to get into this next. This is part of the expenditure tables. When you mark what Naomi showed you on slide 36, when you mark that contributing to and you put a yes, it's going to start populating this contributing expenditures table. And it's going to, you're going to have to put if it's the scope. Is it LEA wide? Is it, focused on one specific student group? So this is a way that you can show that how you're increasing or improving services. So just when Lindsay talks about the expenditure tables, she might touch on this, but one of the things that'll be populated here. Any questions or anybody else want to add anything about increased or improved? This is a sticky section and we are going to talk about it quite a bit. Anybody's brain want to You guys got it all? You guys totally got it?
This is Adela again. I just want to say that this was the hardest section on the learning continuity, and it's the one that I'm still working on. It's due today, but this explanation actually quite helped me a lot.
Oh, good.
So thank you.
Awesome. Anybody else? All right. Let's take a minute, and if you guys think of anything, are we on time? I don't even know where we're at.
Yes, Alicia, well done.
All right. Did anybody have any questions about conclusory statements? Well, shoot, you all graduate. All right, let's talk about some fiscal. Lindsay, is that you?
I'm going to be Lindsay's hype man to get this started.
James.
On Friday afternoon, I figure we need, if we're going to do spreadsheets, we need to get the energy up. I assume everybody's leaning in. I can't see a lot of cameras are up, but I assume everyone's leaning in, is so excited, probably standing up because you just like have to move around. So I'm going to cover some, talk about the expenditure tables and talk about some other fiscal considerations. And then I will turn it over to Lindsay because I'm sure that's who y'all came to hear on the fiscal side to talk about the budget overview for parents. So we're going to avoid getting into the nitty gritty details of the expenditures as more of an introduction into the expenditure tables because again, it's Friday afternoon. You guys have already been on here for an hour and a half and we don't want you falling asleep before the end of the presentation. So to introduce them, the expenditure tables that we've referenced a few times throughout today, it's a separate Excel document, a big table. It's actually one data entry screen that helps tie in the budget and the LCAP data points. And then those tables feed off of that data, or the data input table feeds into some other sheets that slice and dice the different information a couple different ways for stakeholder groups. It was designed in an attempt to be more transparent with the fiscal data that's in the LCAP. As you guys have seen, if you've been in the LCAP process at all, there's been some iterations of the LCAP document. So this is a way to increase the transparency of the documents, the expenditure document that goes with the LCAP. So this is what the data entry table looks like. And I know you guys are anxious to get in there because it just looks so exciting, but it's literally one giant spreadsheet where you're going to list all the goals, actions, and a lot of detailed information. And so the reason we want to introduce them now is because I think you can build a lot of good tools. There's a lot of good pathways for fiscal and program to work together and have more cohesive conversations through these expenditure tables. I think it helps bridge some of the conversations. Us fiscal people like spreadsheets. And so this is a good way to organize those thoughts, I think, moving forward. So if we go to the next, this is the expenditure tables. They may not align with your internal process that you have right now. And that's okay, but it might be a good opportunity to revisit that tracking process and see what your fiscal team is doing, how they're giving you that information so that you guys can improve that process and make it more seamless. It also gives you an opportunity, if your fiscal team is not tracking on a detailed level, for them to make some changes and start tracking. I think this year with the learning continuity and attendance plan kind of being a hard stop on the LCAP process for years past, it's a good opportunity to reset. So if you do need to change some things, this is, don't waste the opportunity to change the internal processes you guys have set up when it comes to LCAP and tracking LCAP, especially on the budget side. And so just a minute to reflect. I don't know how much for those newbies, or if you're not a newbie, you've gotten in to see how you guys are tracking those LCAP expenditures and the document within the budget. But I wanted to take a minute and have you guys kind of think about it and think about the data entry tables that are coming that will be needed for next year, and how you can use those documents to work with your fiscal team, or if they're going to do it on their own and just give that information to you. What's your process going to look like? And of course, I would encourage you not to work separately and try to come together and work on this as a team. So take a minute to think about it. And then if there's any questions, of course, feel free to drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself and throw them out there.
James, am I right in remembering that if they use the state provided Word and Excel templates, the Word and Excel don't talk to each other? So just a heads up, if you're entering in your actions under the goals and actions section of the LCAP, you have to kind of manually transfer that data over. However,
Yeah.
if you use the state electronic template or a tool like tracking services, it does help automate that data entry.
Yes, great. You're remembering correctly, Brian. They are, although they're trying to tie everything together, they're not bridged unless, like you said, you're using an electronic template or something from DTS or some other outside service provider. Any other questions on the expenditure tables? Curiosities? Like I said, I think it will help improve some conversations, even if it's just internally. But they will be, I think, cumbersome to get used to. But I think they will be ultimately a great tool for LCAP teams. We can move along, Brian. So leading right into that, trying to talk about how we can marry the LCAP and the budget together, bring them closer together. And I think one of the earliest things that needs to happen is starting with a common concept of what base services are, and taking a hard look at what is a base service that's being provided, especially as we get into some tighter budget times, and then look at what we're already doing that has increased or improved above where we are. So, I mean, if we go from the 2021 year to 21-22, a lot of folks will have implemented one-to-one devices, new things that they've done with a lot of the extra money that came along with CARES and the COVID crisis. And so looking at where we've actually increased or improved above the base we normally provide, it'll be a good point to move forward. And then, of course, as you know, there's a proportionality element. So we have to be increasing or improving to a certain extent. But then having internal conversations about how and when do we have the ability to change those actions or implement new actions and services. On the budget end, so the districts will work on their adopted budget for a fiscal year. So as we get into the later part of this current year, districts will start working on their adopted budget. The budget process actually starts very early. It starts in January, similar to how you guys start the LCAP process very early. But the actual adopted budget itself is adopted in June, which is why that LCFF calculator will change several times as you're working through with your fiscal team, but it'll be final and adopted in June with the LCAP. Those budget projections are projections at the beginning of the year, so they get updated. And so there's two main reporting periods that fall within the fiscal year where districts have to give financial updates. They actually submit them to our office. And that's the first interim budget and the second interim budget. And this year, it's a first interim budget and an LCAP. So this year is kind of a wonky year. But normally there's at least a budget update in December. And of course, this year there's not LCAP in December, excuse me, there's the BOP in December that goes with the first interim. And then in March, districts will submit a second interim report. So they're fine-tuning their budget as they go through the year, that first and second interim budget process. And those are excellent opportunities to be looking at the LCAP, look at where expenditures are falling in the LCAP from that plan that was adopted in June, and where we stand at December and where we stand at March, so we know where we are with our spending plan, make sure we're implementing the actions of the LCAP. And so, like we've said, I think we say this at every LCAP workshop, that we think that the best way for the LCAP to be an effective document is when there's collaboration between the fiscal and program teams. It requires a lot of new language. It requires fiscal folks breaking out of their spreadsheets and learning how to use different colors, which I must say DFS implemented some colors in later slides. I didn't put them in mine. I gave Lindsay all the colorful slides. And for folks that are on the program side, learning some of the fiscal language that comes in with the budget and how the budget process works, because every district the budget process is a little bit different. So it's important to have those conversations about how the budget is being built and how that plays into the LCAP development. And with that, I will turn it over to Lindsay to cover the budget overview for parents, unless there's any other questions before she gets into the BOP. All right, take it away, Lindsay.
All right, thank you, James. Hi, everyone. For those who are new, my name is Lindsay Gleason. I'm an administrator with our Fiscal Services Unit and have been providing some service in coordination with our program team throughout the last, 7 years of LCAP. One of the things that was new to us last year was that the state added some ed code that required LEAs and county offices of education to add what is called the budget overview for parents to the LCAP at the beginning of each year. So by July 1st, when you're doing your LCAP, you'd add the budget overview for parents. Next. What is the budget overview for parents? It's supposed to be a summarized version of combining both some budget information as well as information that comes from your LCAP and providing it so that parents or stakeholders can read it in a user-friendly format and kind of see a very summarized version of both documents and coordinating them so they can see what is going on within your LCAP in relation to that budget. So to take a moment, and hopefully this is going to be some new information for those of you who have been seasoned in this process. We aren't through the budget overview for parents this year. It still exists and it will be due by December 15th. And in order to do that, because we didn't have an LCAP year this year, but we had a learning continuity plan, they had to modify some of that template. So the template's going to look very familiar to some of you that are used to seeing it from last year, but it has some slight variances in this new year. Next. So what happened? We had a couple of things happen. First, we took that budget overview and we took it away from the LCAP, and now we're going to be tying it to first interim. So for those of you who aren't in the fiscal world, the first interim report is similar to your adopted budget. It's just a different time frame, a different reporting, and it will be updated by December 15th every year. It also changed some wording essentially and took out that LCAP wording and adjusted it to be a learning continuity plan wording. And then basically what it's trying to do is do the same type of actions of combining that bridge and that user-friendly format, but instead of looking at adopted budget and LCAP, it'll now be looking at first interim and learning continuity plan. So for those of you who have not seen the budget overview yet, what you see here on the screen is there is a screenshot of the data entry tab. And really this is where the bulk of the information will come from in order for you to help describe to your parents what has happened between your first interim and your learning continuity plan. And like I mentioned before, this will change, but it will still be existing next year when you're doing that LCAP. So it's really important to understand kind of the concept behind it. The BOP for this year was sent to both a program lead and also a fiscal lead at your district. So we've actually, hopefully, I know Alicia had mentioned earlier, she didn't want to send you into the weekend crying. Hopefully I'm not doing that by giving you a spreadsheet ahead of time. However, we did fill in some of that spreadsheet for you. So a little sigh of relief, and you have a good fiscal team member that can help you out at your districts and helping you understand where this information comes from. But big picture, on this screenshot, you're going to see some boxes on the right-hand side that are circled. So that or squared off, I guess. There's a red square, a blue square, and a green square. That red square, all of those items, all of that information is going to come from your district's first interim budget. So you can't be finished with the budget overview for parents prior to finishing your first interim. They're all going to go to the same board meeting. However, this information would need to be filled in after your first interim report is ready with all of the numbers. The blue circle or square that's there, those numbers are going to come from your learning continuity plan. Those are the numbers we've pre-filled for you. If you do have any modifications that are going on with your learning continuity plan, they would need to be updated in this spreadsheet. However, we were able to go through and use your existing plan since that's already been given to our office and fill in that spreadsheet for you. On the green cell or green square, what you'll see there is it's actually almost a preview of an annual update. So that's 2019-20. So it's referencing last year's LCAP. And we have added the first box for you, and it's talking about the services that you did that were contributing last year and what you actually spent. So the second cell there would be tying to your 2019-20 actual expenditures. In this Excel spreadsheet that we sent you, we also sent you a how-to guide. So I don't want you to get too into the weeds of how do I fill this in yet. I just want you to know that there's several different places this information comes from. There is a guide for you, as well as we have 3 coordinators here at our office that are amazing at helping you walk through that should you have any questions. So this is just kind of a little preview for you. So, like I had mentioned before, the budget overview for parents needs to be adopted by December 15th. That's the same deadline as your first interim. It will go in the same board meeting as your first interim report. So they will be coordinated together for your board. If you fill in that spreadsheet first and complete the document, as well as you're ready with your first interim report and you provide that to our office, we can do a double check for you. And what we'd like to do is prevent any errors from going to board, similar to like what we would do with a fast pass process. We'll just call it a fast pass process for budget overview for parents, to kind of give you a heads up, give you any feedback so that you are prepared to be really successful with your board and your stakeholders. Additionally, one more thing that's a requirement for all LEAs is that you're going to post that on your website. So just something to keep in mind there, that it's going to be a public document. It's very forward facing. It's meant to be so that your community will see it for you. And that's, I think, kind of the end of my really general conversation about the BOP. But something to think about, how are you monitoring your fiscal process? Are you coordinating with your fiscal staff? I know it was mentioned earlier that you can reach out to our office. Oftentimes, though, when those timelines are so short, we may not have your LCFF calculator that your district is using for your first interim report prior to you seeing it. So, or to us being able to help provide that for you. So it's really important, like James was saying, to coordinate with your fiscal staff and to know that some of that information, you're really going to rely on them to help provide. How can you get there with collaboration, and what are your next steps? Let's take a couple minutes to think about that, as well as if you have any questions about the budget overview. I know it's very new. We can help answer those as well. And if you weren't on the email that received the budget overview and the how-to guide, and you just want to see it, you can ask who it was sent to in your office, or just ask us for a copy, and we would love to send that to you. The how-to guide is really helpful in understanding where things come from for the budget overview.
Thank you, James and Lindsay, for that overview of fiscal considerations and such. And it's so wonderful to collaborate with you guys. So again, if you have any questions, you think of them as we go along. We're actually at the end of the session. So I wanted to take the time to give you some links for the LCAP workshops. We have these first 2 sessions, brief little workshops for as a refresher and for those who are new to the LCAP world, but our official workshops start in November. You can see on the slide, the first one is virtual. It will be 9 to 12 on November 6th. We're actually going to combine district and charter. I'm sorry, I failed to separate that, Alicia. So it will only be the one registration for 11/6, and we'll remove that link for the charter workshop. And the second workshop is in January. We are required to have that virtual format for that as well. And so we're going to cut it by half an hour and do 9 to 3. And we promise to be very engaging during that virtual session and engage, allow lots of time for you and your district teams to work together. So So please plan on that. And then 3 and 4, we're hoping to be in person, but we'll keep you posted as public health orders and orders from our bosses dictate what venue we will be using for that. So save the dates for those. And we did mention the CDE Tuesday at 2 webinar next Tuesday on the annual update. So hopefully you can join. I will be there. So if you aren't able to, I'll capture that information. And then
Naomi,
just
can I-
lastly, go ahead.
Just really quick, I was just going to say for these workshops, I think we want to encourage you to, if you can, have some of your fiscal folks come with you, bring a team. Don't just come as a team of one, because there is a lot to be said for that conversation that you can have around what we share in these meetings. So if you can, convince a fiscal person to come with you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the whole team is always invited as that supports the comprehensive planning and development of your LCAP. Thank you, Alicia. And then what was I going to say? Oh, the last 2 Fridays, we've given you a lot of information. I know it was introductory, but as you think of anything, questions or you want individual support, just reach out to us. We've got our program team there. You can reach out to any of us, whether or not we're leading that work. We can always refer you to the person you need. There's our data team and their services. And then we also, as part of our team, we've got our charter schools unit. And then, of course, we cannot forget our district fiscal services team that is always there to support us. So on that, I would like to wish you a happy afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Our team will stay on if you guys have any questions. As always, reach out if you need anything. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Lorelei, for that. We're happy to help. Thanks, Skip. Glad you could join us.
Hi, kiddo. Hey, so Melissa and I are bantering.
You're bantering?
We're bantering back and forth. Actually, she's just being a really good listener.
In chats, right?
He is that.
Yeah. So some of the colleagues of mine in private chats, we're really discussing, it's really going to be difficult to write a 3-year LCAP based off the extensive learning loss that we're seeing. And the extensive learning loss we're seeing, one specifically at like elementary level with Lexia or iReady or whatever, a school district uses. These assessments are typically done in person, right? Typically, they're not at home on this format. Typically, they're not with a mom or a dad sitting right next to them. And